Welcome to the online interview series for the UNESCO Inclusive Policy Lab. My name is Christine Kavazanjan, and I'll be hosting today's podcast. The Inclusive Policy Lab is UNESCO's global online platform dedicated to crowdsourcing knowledge and expertise on matters of inclusive policies. There are currently over 1,400 users of the lab, including leading experts in research, international and development actors, and policymaking around the world. The lab is open to all to access publications, policy design tools, and collaborative teams for discussion on inclusive policy on specific topics. Climate justice is understanding and addressing how the burden and consequences of climate change may be borne unequally and taking action via research, policies, and other means to correct the same. Today, we will be speaking to Tahseen Jafry, Professor and Director at the Centre for Climate Justice at Glasgow Caledonian University, where she hosted the inaugural World Forum on Climate Justice earlier this year. Her research interests include the justice and equity aspects of climate change, gender and poverty targeting, and the management of natural resources. Tahseen, welcome to the IPL podcast. We are delighted to have you.
Thank you. Welcome. Great to be here.
Fantastic. So I'm going to dive into our first question. Climate change is a pressing global concern across nations and sectors, but the burden of the consequences is borne unequally. How do you think socioeconomic inequalities intersect with the effects of climate change?
Well, let's look at this for a moment and try and unpack that question. What do we mean by socioeconomic inequalities? From my perspective, what we're dealing with are issues of people being marginalised, left behind, they have no voice, they're disempowered, they have little representation of their needs, and are therefore often the most poorest in society. And as such, they have little capacity to adapt to changes around them, and they can't really take risks, and they don't really have a buffer to be able to protect themselves. If we look at climate change and extreme weather events, climate change, as we know, since industrialisation has been progressing over a period of time, and extreme weather events have been having devastating consequences around the world: floods, droughts, unpredictable weather. And these are all playing havoc with rural and remote communities whose lives revolve around weather-based and are dependent on weather for their livelihoods, such as farming, agriculture, fisheries and forestry. So if we're looking at how do these things intersect, the communities I'm talking about, the poorest, they have contributed little to climate change and carbon emissions, but they are the ones who are suffering the most. And herein lies the problem of climate injustice. And I think we cannot achieve climate justice unless we put the spotlight on the injustice issues. So those are the issues that are facing these poorest communities, the impacts that climate and extreme weather events is having on their lives and their livelihoods.
Thank you so much. That's very interesting to look at the perspective of how they intersect and looking at climate injustice. Typically, we see climate change and injustice looked at separately. So thank you for describing how they could intersect. So my second question for you is that your research indicates that marginalized groups, as you spoke about, such as women and children, are at a particular disadvantage. How are these groups affected by existing practices and policies? What do you think can be done to reverse or resolve this? And if possible, could you provide some examples of things that you have observed?
If we just look at this in more detail, women and children, particularly girl children, are a particular disadvantage. In many parts of the world, they are responsible for household chores, collecting water, fuel wood, cooking, providing for the family, but they're also involved in agriculture and post-agricultural tasks. And as the climate changes, women and girls have to walk further and for longer to fetch water and fuel wood. And the further they get away from the protection of their home and the lands, the more they are at risk of being trafficked and abducted. This is happening right now in many parts of the world. Existing policies and practices, what do we mean by this, and how can we reverse or address the existing practices to protect women and girls in particular? I think we need to look at those issues across different sectors, whether it's agriculture or energy or from a human rights perspective. We need to ensure that the needs of women and girls are clearly highlighted in national and local policies, deliberately and with intention, so that their needs are prioritised and so they are protected and given, the right to lead a decent quality of life. So in terms of getting access to water, we need to be able to ensure national policies within those frameworks, there is direction and focus clearly identified within those frameworks to address these needs, whether that's about enabling women and girls to have easier access to water, or whether there's more resources put in place to help them, but also ensuring that they're not left behind. So those policies and practice need to be reflective and be gender sensitive. And from my experience, from what I see, policies aren't often gender sensitive. They're often just a blanket framework for national governments. So I'm talking about access to water, but we can also apply this to access to energy and clean energy. For example, the use. A lot of people in rural and remote communities don't have access to clean energy.
Yeah, I would absolutely agree. I mean, it's interesting how you pointed out that already marginalized groups become even further marginalized if we don't pay enough attention to how we construct our policies and practices. So thank you for sharing those examples and your opinion. How would you assess the current knowledge on the interlinkages between inequalities and climate change drivers and impacts? What is the level, in your opinion, of integration between the two scientific research fields?
Yeah, so if you look at the two things together, my assessment of current critical thinking, knowledge and insight relates to the wider debates we hear. And I'm referring to things like COP and, COP25, which is taking place in Madrid right now. I think, overall, there seems to be a lot of work done on globally on, I would say specifically on gender issues and inequality in the sector. All the major bodies and organisations, UN bodies, NGOs, grassroots movements and so on, I would say have done pretty extensive work looking at some of these issues on inequality. So my issue with this is that there's this huge body of knowledge out there. We have big events that are happening, like COP25. The next one's going to be here in Glasgow next year. But we still are in such a desperate state of addressing the status of women and girls and looking at inequalities. And I have to wonder why that is from a development perspective. There's still so much to be done out there, and there's still many bottlenecks and challenges to overcome, which I fear are often sort of deep-seated and deep-rooted. And compounding this is obviously the climate emergency that the world is facing. And so with the climate emergency debates that are happening right now, there's talks around biodiversity, we're looking at green infrastructure, there's talk about adaptation, carbon capture and storage, climate finance, and so on and so on and so on. So in terms of integrating the linkages between inequalities and issues that marginalised and poor communities are facing and climate change drivers and impact, I think we need to be much stronger and bolder with some hard-hitting targets to be able to bring these things together. And if I think about the Sustainable Development Goals, we're looking at a number of those goals, particularly goal, I think it's 5 that looks at gender equality, and 13 on climate action, and start bridging and overlapping the achievement of these goals and thinking about how we're actually going to deliver them. Because in my mind, if we don't, then issues of inequality are just going to get left behind. For me, it's really clear in my mind that we cannot separate issues. And at the core of this is it's people's lives. It's the right to a decent quality of life. And I often ask myself, are we in the global north denying people who are the poorest and the most vulnerable the right to a decent quality of life? And I do wonder whether we are doing that. And that, for me, is inhumane when I see the suffering that I see through my work in some of the poorest parts of the world.
So, diving into a more technical question, the IPCC report entitled Global Warming of 1.5 degrees Celsius states that limiting global warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius instead of 2 degrees Celsius could lead to a more sustainable outcome. What does this mean to you in practical terms? And how and to what extent would this be beneficial to ensure reductions in inequalities and a more equitable society?
So if we just look at those figures there, limiting global warming to 1.5 and ensuring it doesn't go over to 2 degrees and above, there are going to be benefits, if we are able to do that. But I don't think we are on track with that. But if we were, then we would see less heat waves. There will be, sea level rise won't be as high as it would be, and incidences of heavy rainfall, the intensity of rainfall will come down. And so we will get, I think there are predictions that if we keep global warming to 1.5, then crop yields wouldn't be as damaged as they might be. But what's happening right now is we are actually on track for a 3 to 4 degree temperature rise, which is extremely worrying. In the UK here, we are heading for net zero carbon emissions by 2050, and to be able to keep within limits of global warming, every nation needs to start looking at bringing down the carbon emissions, but particularly those who are the highest polluting. How do we do that? And it is putting in place technical innovation and solutions that are going to help bring down carbon emissions, whether it's within the farming sector or within industry, our transport sector, and how we live our lives. I think behavioural change is a huge part of it, so everyone needs to be on this journey together. But we also need to see the most polluting nations signing up to this: Australia, China, and South Africa. And if we are to do this, the world would benefit. But like I said earlier, we're not on track to reach those targets.
And you say that we're more so on track for a 3 to 4 degree temperature rise.
Yep.
Do you think that we can recover from that, even when recover from the impacts of that, even when we have countries signing up to make changes in their policies and practices?
I think what we're going to see is how we recover from that will depend on the extent to which the impacts will be felt, not just by society but within the natural world as well. Some species are actually will become extinct, to which you cannot go back from, and that's a fact. And the thing that worries me is when we talk about things such as displacement and migration. The reason why things like that are happening in the increase in incidence of human trafficking from climate refugees moving around the place in different parts of the world is to what extent it is going to lead to conflict across different nations, because we will, in terms of our natural resources, our water supplies are going to go down, rivers are drying up, we're going to see many more droughts, and people need to survive. Population is on the rise, and so it's a question of survival, and one has to wonder who's going to take responsibility to ensure the survival and the protection of individuals, so that we as nations, as societies, we do not suffer. And but I see more ahead, and I see a lot more deaths happening. In fact, the World Health Organization estimated that because of climate change, there will be an additional 250,000 deaths happening worldwide. So, which is really depressing, and I want to be a bit more positive about it. But I think what's frustrating me is a lack of, focus and attention on some of these deeply concerning issues that are facing humanity right now.
You're absolutely right. You took the words out of my mouth. I was going to say it is a deeply concerning issue, and I hope that your frustrations create the awareness and the focus that nations and society needs to in fact, like you said, take responsibility to drive change. So Tahseen, throughout the podcast, you have highlighted many of the challenges that we face due to climate injustice. What would you say are the most pressing challenges in affording climate justice? And if you can provide some examples, that would be great.
Yeah, so I would say we cannot not afford to achieve climate justice. And to do this correctly, I think we need to be adopting frameworks and approaches to ensure that those justice issues are given due consideration in planning processes, whether it's in projects or programs, and also in determining how climate finance is utilised and distributed correctly, so it falls in the hands of those that need it the most to help them to adapt to their changing environment. In terms of pressing challenges, I think recognising and acknowledging that these issues are really important, but also recognising that those who have contributed least to global warming, the ones that are suffering the most, must be protected. So getting recognition and acknowledgement of that is high on the agenda. And to support that, we need resources and funding to push for the use of looking and adopting climate justice frameworks so that the needs of those people are not left behind. But I also think it's a matter of educating and training and changing the mindsets of policy and decision makers to be able to look at climate change and inequality and social justice issues together through a lens that leads to the impacts of climate change, being managed better moving forward.
Sounds like there is an incredible amount of work to do on everybody's part. And if I, as an individual, wanted to take part in making a change and driving change in my society, my nation, do you have any advice on how I could take action myself?
Yeah, I think it's that one where you're trying to, it's that connection local, global. So it comes down to, with individuals, it's down to people's lifestyles and their lifestyle choices and behavioural change. And I think as an individual, you do everything you can to keep your carbon footprint as low as it can, because if everyone plays their part, it have a cumulative effect to, reducing carbon emissions. But I think, so the things that you can do, practical ways to do that is important. But I also think putting your support behind, platforms that talk about the need to address injustice issues is really important. And I think the more social movements that we see on this issue, perhaps, we will reach a point where at some point someone will say, yes, we do need to be talking about this. Because humanity, the future of humanity lies within these big conversations that are happening right now.
That is incredibly true. And thank you for your insights. You've highlighted some really important elements for individuals, for countries, for governments to take note of. Are there any last thoughts that you'd like to share with our listeners today on climate justice before we wrap up the interview?
So I guess for me, my last thoughts on climate justice, it is, for me, it's about, the human right to development. And I'm really passionate about this agenda. I've worked in some of the most poorest parts of the world over 25 years across sub-Saharan Africa and South Asia and small island states. But, what I see when I visit some of these places is the resilience and the smiley faces that greet me when I meet some of the most vulnerable people that I have met. And that just tells me that if people are given the right resources and the support they need, they will move on with their lives, because they have to. It's a matter of survival. And that just, connecting and being in the environments where, where people are smiling even though they've lost everything from flooding, is hope. And I think we need to build on the hope that I see out there, rather than ignoring that. And I think as nations we need to get behind people, because everybody matters at the end of the day.
Thank you for ending it on a positive note. It's beautiful to hear that there is still hope even in the individuals that suffer the most from these injustices. Thank you once again, Tahseen, for your incredibly important insights today. To our listeners, for more information on Professor Jafry's research on climate justice, please visit the Centre for Climate Justice website at www.gcu.ac.uk/climate justice. You can also follow on social media channels at GCU Climate Just or Tahseen herself at Jafry T.